Hi everyone, it's Artem Mushin-Makedonskiy and Business Storytelling again, and tonight we have a special guest. Please welcome Bill Baker. Bill is a storyteller and a trainer for over more than 12 years. He has trained executives, scientists, and various people, including people from Fortune 500 companies. And Bill is not only an expert in storytelling, but he and his company also help organizations uncover their story and tell other people why they're doing what they're doing and what is their real purpose in life in terms of communication with the world. Bill, it's a real honor to have you here. From the moment one of my colleagues wrote to me and said you have to invite Bill, I was dreaming about this day, and here you are now, and it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining.
The pleasure is mine. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So Bill, I know something about you, well, not nothing, but it's something, and I would like you to begin with your story, because my audience doesn't know a lot about you, I guess. And can you tell, how did you end up in the storytelling profession?
Well, when I started working after I graduated from university, I was in the advertising business. I started in New York City working for big multinational agencies, and then I moved to Vancouver in Canada in 1998, and I continued working for ad agencies. And I started as a client service guy, but then in the middle of my career, strategic planning and brand planning started to become a thing in the advertising business, and I moved into that. And I always loved working with clients, helping them figure out who they are, what they're all about, why they exist, but not only defining that, but making sure all their employees, their partners, and their stakeholders also understood that and could wrap their heads and hearts around it. So I really enjoyed that discipline, that science of brand planning and strategic planning. And then I got recruited by a storytelling company and was able to combine that discipline of strategic planning with the magic of storytelling. And when I started working at this small company based in Vancouver, I thought I died and gone to heaven. And it was a really wonderful thing for me to be able to do that at that point in my career. So I started doing that. And as you said earlier, we really help organizations, divisions of companies figure out who they are and what they're about, and wrap that in a narrative that they can then use to engage and align and unlock the human energy needed to bring that story to life and to live that story every day. So that's how I started in the storytelling world. But then at some point, I kind of stumbled into storytelling training. I was presenting at a conference in Chicago many, many years ago, and someone from a large Fortune 500 company saw me speak, and they had someone on their team call me up later. This is GE, General Electric. And they said, my boss saw you speak at this conference, and she said you did a really good job talking about storytelling and using storytelling to engage employees. And I said, oh, that's really nice to hear. And she said, but she said that you told a lot of really good stories in your talk. And I said, oh, that's also very nice to hear. And she said, have you ever taught anyone how to do that? And I said, no. And then she said, do you think you could teach someone how to do that? And I'm like, sure, why not? And that's how I got into storytelling training, was someone actually asking me to come in and do that for their group. And then it's grown from there.
Oh, that's a nice story. Thank you so much. I love how your experience meets the coincidence in the story, and that's
yeah.
The world has reached out to you in some
Exactly.
way.
It's the universe speaking to me in some way.
Yeah, that's cute, and that's cool about it. You've actually started about the discipline of strategic brand planning, and combined with the magic of storytelling, and that's a really interesting combination, and I would love to continue with it. But first, I would love to speak about this word strategic, because this is a word I hear from your talks and your work a lot, and some people are focusing on the retellability of the story. Some are focusing on the right moment to tell a story, like creating this, environment where people can share stories. And you are focusing on being strategic. So in that sense, why is it so important? And can you tell me, like, why is it more important than the whole, other things being strategic?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. One of the things I discovered when I started doing this work, I mean, I grew up as a storytelling kid. My family are big storytellers. My dad was a huge storyteller. So storytelling had always been part of my life. But one of the things I quickly discovered is there's a difference between social storytelling and strategic storytelling. Social storytelling that we do with friends and family is just telling any story at any time because you think it's going to engage and entertain people. Like, oh my God, let me tell you what my dog did this morning, or let me tell you about my weekend. Strategic storytelling, especially at work, is about telling the right story to deliver the right message to the right people at the right time. So when I think strategically about the stories I'm telling, I don't start with the story. I think first about what do I need a story to do so I can find and develop the best story to achieve that. So we approach all storytelling training strategy first. I know other trainers tend to focus maybe on delivery first and being a better storyteller. We always focus on strategy first, because in my experience, you could be the best storyteller in the world. You could have the greatest stories to tell, but at work, if it's not the right story at the right time, everything else is academic. It has to have the right message, and that message has to be relevant to the situation you're in. It has to be relevant to your audience, and it has to have a meaningful point. That's what being strategic is about.
Right. So being on point, being in the right time, the right place, the right audience. These are the tools that you have to, be specific about. And
Well, and think about it this way as well, like in
right.
business. So, growing up in the business world, in business, we don't just do something and hope that it's going to turn out okay. We think strategically about it first. All good business initiatives have a strategy behind them. Before we start talking about what we're going to do or how we're going to do it, let's figure out why we're doing it. What are the goals and the objectives that we want to reach? It's the same thing with storytelling. It's not as complex as it is in business, but you have to think first and foremost, why am I telling a story? What do I need a story to achieve so I can find and develop and practice the story that's going to best achieve that?
Okay, got it. So basically, you're saying that before telling a story, you have to answer the question of why, and that's a great question. And here's the thing. I got the idea of strategicness, and clearly there are some barriers that people stumble upon when they like. It's clearly better than not being strategic. It's obvious. So maybe could you share what are the barriers for the people who are not being strategic? What stops them, and how can we maybe help them think about it in a different way and become strategic?
Well, I think there's two barriers. On one barrier, which I alluded to earlier, people think, well, I'm actually a really good storyteller. I tell stories all the time at the dinner table, at the bar, with my friends and my family. So I'm going to do that at work. And I've been in many situations, and you probably have as well, where someone has told a story at work as part of a presentation. And you're kind of looking at each other and saying, okay, I don't know what the point of that story was. Could you get on with the presentation, please? And so they think, oh, I've got a great story to tell, but they're not thinking strategically about whether it's the right story with the right message in that particular situation. So that's one barrier to thinking strategically.
Right.
And that happens. But the other barrier that I see happen more often is a lot of people, especially in people that do my training, they'll say like, I'm an awful storyteller. I am such a bad storyteller. And so they psych themselves out of using storytelling in workplace communications because they think they're not the best storyteller. And I always say to them, listen, if you think strategically about it first and you make sure it's the right story with the right message, you put a little bit of work into the content of that story to make sure it has good structure and flow, and you practice it, you're going to hit it out of the park. You may not be the best storyteller in the world, but if it's the right story, and it's a well-constructed story, that is 90% of it. And yes, some people have a more natural talent at being a storyteller than others, but if it is the right story and it's a good story and it's well-structured, it can still have a really good impact on an audience at work.
Got it. So, okay, great. Those are two barriers that are actually like on the different sides of one continuum. Ones think that they're
Yeah, it is
great.
on the different continuum. Yeah.
Yeah, that's neat. So you have to be closer to the middle, and that's a great advice. So folks, if you find yourself on one of those, just try to move back to the middle. Here's the thing, though. You said that the story has to be structured, and that's a topic we really discuss quite often because some storytellers have, different structures to their work. But the second thing you said, it was the first one actually, that the story has to be on point, so it has to deliver the right message. So maybe without like disclosing all of your methodology or the things, so maybe there's one advice you could give for the people that want to check if their story is on point or it isn't before actually falling into the test on the audience they would like to tell it to.
Yeah, well, so when I'm thinking strategically about what do I need a story to do so I can find the best story to meet those objectives, I lay out those objectives and I think to myself, first and foremost, who's my audience that I'm talking to and what do I want them to do? Literally, what action do I want them to take? Start doing, stop doing, do more of, do less of. And then I consider, okay, knowing that audience as well as I can, what do I think they need to think and or feel in order to take that action? And sometimes those are new thoughts and feelings I want to introduce to them. Sometimes those are mental and emotional barriers that I need to help them get over. And then I consider what's a message or a point that I could deliver to them to get them to think and feel that way, to get them to do what I want them to do. And then once I've identified all that, I try to have a story from my own experience, someone else's experience, from history, from sports, from literature. I try to find a story that's going to deliver that message, to shape those thoughts and feelings, to motivate that action. So that's backing into the story by first, it's kind of like you're writing a strategic brief for the story and then finding the best story to meet that brief.
That's great, because I've heard a lot about the natural way of doing it. Like Doug Lippman is growing a story from a seed, which is like a memory, and you grow it to achieve some results. And in this process of growth, you become aware of what does this story hold and how does it influence people. And you're telling me about like you can do it in reverse, from the goal back to the story. And here's the thing I would like to ask you. There is this point where you've discovered what you need to get them to think or to feel, and then you have to find the story. So here's the thing, I really often see people that are like, okay, I know those two things, but like, what should they tell? There are like many options, or there are none at all. So maybe there's a trick to find those stories to connect with the think and feel part.
Well, yeah, so there's lots of different ways you can find that story. For me, once I identify what I need that story to do, then I start trying to find that story. For me, I always think about my own experience first. Do I have an experience from life, from work, when I was a kid, when I became an adult? Do I have a story from my own experience that can deliver that message? If yes, great, I develop that story. If not, I think, have I heard a story from someone else? Is there an analogous story from history? Is there a great story from sports that deliver on that point? I will go to Google sometimes and I will type in, I need a story about taking risks, top 10 stories about taking risks. So there's lots of places you can find that story from your own history, someone else's history, literature, media, whatever. The other
Got
thing,
it.
Artem, though, I'll say, and to your point earlier, when I was talking to you about thinking strategically, that's starting with a need for a story and finding a story to fit that need. However, there is often, you have a story, you're starting with a story. Like I've been developing lots of stories during this COVID-19 situation because I'm having experiences where I'm learning new things all the time. So when I start with a story, I go in the reverse order of what I was just talking to you about. So I have a great experience, a great story, and I'm wondering, that'd be a good story for me to put in my story library for work. So what I do is I start to peel back the layers of that story. So I think to myself, I had a great experience. Then did I learn something from that experience? Is there a message or a lesson or a point that I could share? And very often there is. And sometimes, nope, it's just pure entertainment. That's it. But if I did learn something, might that learning shape thoughts and feelings in other people? If yes, might it actually motivate an action or a change in behavior? If yes, then I have a good story in my library. I just have to find the appropriate time, place, or audience with whom to share it.
Great. So there's a second way there.
Yeah, it's like
Great to
two
hear.
roads. It's two roads. One road starting with a need and finding the story to fill that need. The other
Good.
road is starting with a story and then finding an appropriate time or place to use that story in workplace communications.
Oh, I like that's not limited to one way only, because I thought it wouldn't be, but it's
Yeah.
great. It's great to hear that it isn't. So okay, back to the topic you've actually already pointed up, and it's the combination of the discipline of strategic brand and the magic of storytelling, because those are strategic and magic. Some things are not connected easily. Can you tell me a little bit more about how they are connected, how they are related, and maybe what are the barriers that companies face that when they are trying to connect those dots?
Well, I think in terms of how they're connected, stories, and I know other people that you've interviewed have talked about this, but stories appeal more to our whole person, not just our heads, but our hearts. They get us to expand our thinking. They engage us in multiple levels. There's been lots of science that show how stories work with our brains better, how they stick with our brains better, because they activate more of our brain versus just pure information. So I won't repeat all that because I know you've heard it from other people before, but stories really do engage more of our being. And when we're at work, we are bringing a whole person to work. I'm not just bringing you one little part of my brain into that job. I'm bringing my whole mind, body, and soul into that job. And what's been heartwarming to see is organizations recognizing that information on its own is not going to be enough for me to fully engage my team, my employees, and get them to do what I need them to do. I have to engage with them on multiple levels. Don't get me wrong, sometimes pure information is very, very powerful, but information combined with insight and inspiration engages more of my whole being and gets me more engaged in terms of what we need to do and why we need to do it. So I think that's what, companies are recognizing is I've got full, whole human beings here at work. I need to engage them at a more full and whole, a more whole level.
Got it. So
Make sense?
yes, exactly. And it makes sense in a sense why there is a connection uh, that needs to be found in this topic. But here's the thing. Can you tell me about one of the companies that that are doing a great job, in terms of maybe one of your clients that are doing a great job in getting their brand story out there, their story of their, you know, in terms of storytelling and still being strategic?
Well, I think, a lot of when you think about story companies that are doing a great job with their brand story, it's probably the same companies that you think are doing a great job with their brand. So the classics like, Apple and Nike and Zappos, which is a retailer in the United States, companies like that tend to do a really good job of promoting the story of their brand and people really knowing, I know what this brand is about and I know what they stand for. One of the things that I realized when I got into this work, actually when I was still in the advertising business.
Hmm.
So when I was still working in advertising and helping companies figure out what their brand was about, and then they would push that out to the marketplace with big campaigns and advertising execution, but they would never actually talk to their own teams about what their brand was about. And so what was happening is they were creating a disconnect in the marketplace because they do this whole brand planning work and then they do a big Super Bowl ad, but they would forget to tell the people who answer the phones. And when I, as a customer, don't
Oh,
have
that's
that
good.
consistent experience, I have this expectation that's set from this beautiful commercial that you've done about what you're all about and what drives and motivates you. And then I go into the store and I don't experience that in the store. It's a disconnect. And when that disconnect happens, I don't trust you anymore, so I'm not going to do business with you anymore. So that's why the storytelling work has to be not just external, but internal as well. In fact, and I'm sure you've heard this, when we work with clients on their organizational story, we make sure start internally first. Make sure all of your employees, all of your strategic partners, your board, your stakeholders, everyone really understands this story before you share it, any part of it, with the outside world. That's going to create more consistency and cohesion in not only telling that story, but bringing that story consistently to life.
Great. Now that's an insight for me, because starting with the inside is something a company would rarely do when it comes to storytelling, because, well, stereotypically storytelling is something about telling about yourself to the other people. But here's the thing: you have to start with the inside. That's a great insight.
Well, so I define storytelling a little bit differently. Is when we talk about storytelling, and I don't know if this is the actual definition, but I put out to the people we work with, I want you to think of storytelling as an exchange of meaning between people. It's
Right.
an exchange of meaning shared from one person to another. And I believe that if it's not shared from one person to another, it's not a story. It's like that old adage, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound? I don't think it's a story until that story is actually bounced off of someone else. Even if the story is about me, my sharing of that story is not about me. I'm not sharing a story about me and something I've overcome or a struggle I've had to pat myself on the back. I'm sharing this story because I struggled with something, I've succeeded, but I learned something that I think you're going to benefit from hearing. One of my colleagues
Yeah.
who has taught me a lot about storytelling, he said to me once, even if the story is about you, you're not the hero, your audience is the hero. It's always about your audience and what you want them to get out of it, and making sure they get something meaningful out of that exchange.
Yeah, that's a great way to approach it, really.
Yeah.
I actually have one more question about this organizational part, because your clients have experienced such things when they start from introducing the story inside an organization, and they start from getting all the employees around the story before going to the outside market. Maybe they face this skepticism, and people saying that, oh no, this is just some kind of anecdote and it's not true. And so maybe are there any situations like this that you faced in your work when introducing a storytelling? And if there are, can you tell me about, like, how can you overcome them?
Well, some of the barriers that you sometimes face when you're working with organizations, all organizations are complex, but all organizations are human. Like, business is a human endeavor, and humans love to tell stories. But with that said, when we go in and we work with an organization, we usually work with a core team of people, but we really push them to engage a larger group of people, like their whole senior management. It might be their entire board. And inevitably, there are going to be people on that larger group who are like, please, come on, storytelling, that's a little touchy-feely. They just think there's no
Yeah.
place for storytelling in business. And I run into that cynicism or skepticism all the time. And don't get me wrong, I understand and appreciate where it's coming from, but I will talk to them and get them telling me stories. Well, tell me one of your favorite stories. And they'll tell me one of their favorite stories. It could be a movie, it could be a childhood story, a story they read their own kids. And I'm like, well, what's the point of that story? And they'll share it. I'm like, doesn't that bring meaning to your life? What if that happened at work? So, some people are tougher than others with that cynicism and skepticism, but all people are human, and all organizations are human, and all humans love to tell stories in some way, shape, or form. So when we run into that, and we do run into it often, when we run into that, I try to get people to kind of tap into their own inner storytelling animal, their storytelling child, to recognize, oh yeah, storytelling is actually a very powerful force.
Got it. So yeah, and that's this term storytelling animal, by, I guess it's by Jonathan Gottschall, if I'm not
Yeah, it's
mistaken.
one of my favorite books. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I've read a lot of books on storytelling, but his is one of my favorites, and I recommend it a lot, because it's not, even though he's an academic, it's not overly academic, and it's a good read. I
Yeah,
will tell you
it's
this though, Artem. One of the
mhm.
things, it's interesting when I look at the trajectory of the storytelling training business that we do. It started with a lot of Fortune 500 companies like GE or Coca-Cola or Cisco, but more and more recently, the companies and organizations that are reaching out to me about storytelling training are companies that tend to work in more scientific, left brain sort of endeavors. One of our
Mm,
biggest storytelling clients right now is an organization called the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab. And
wow.
these people, there's 7,000 of them. They are literally rocket scientists. They make rockets that send things into space, that sends missiles into the air. And they are some of the smartest people you've ever worked with. But they are sometimes have a hard time translating why they want to do what they want to do with people like me who don't have that engineering background. So when I talked about teaching scientists and engineers how to use storytelling to position their work instead of just reporting their work, it's been a very, very ripe area for business lately.
Great to hear it, because some scientists are really having trouble with communicating their purpose and their product to to anyone, and that's a real issue. I've been studying in the physics profile class at school myself, and
Yeah.
I've actually failed miserably, and I went to psychology bachelor's. But most of my classmates, they went on to to get the physics degree, and they are really scientists in terms of they're doing some cool stuff, and some of them really are great in terms of telling the story, telling what they are doing in an easy to grasp way, and that's a great thing you're doing.
Yeah, and it's really rewarding, I have to say. I mean, I love teaching storytelling to anyone, but these people in particular, it's wonderful to watch them go through the training, because what I'm asking them to do is to tap into their own humanity. I'm not saying
Right.
forget that you're an engineer or forget that you're a scientist, but I want you to first think about you as a human being talking to other human beings. And before you dive into the complex details of your project or your rocket science initiative, tell a story that brings to life why you're recommending what you're recommending, why you are pursuing this initiative, why you are asking them for money, and use that to connect with your audience, and then dive into the details. And it's just wonderful to see that light bulb go off in their head and then recognize, oh, I can take this thing that I did as a kid, that I do with my own kids, and I can bring this into work, not to replace the important scientific and engineering work I'm doing, but to position it and help people understand the importance of it.
Great.
Yeah,
That's a great thing to do, and this bringing the whole human to the work, either you're in science or in business, that's a great place to be.
it's funny.
Thank you.
I've been to Russia twice. I've been to Moscow twice
Uh-huh.
to do a storytelling workshop with executives from Rosneft.
Wow.
And yeah, and talk about a little bit of a shell around them when we started. They were like, what is this? And over the day, Russians are great storytellers. And over the day, they all kind of got into it and got into it more. So I had finance people, lawyers, engineers in this room in Moscow, and they all started loosening up and really tapping into that inner storyteller. It was wonderful to watch.
Wow, that's huge. I mean, you're, I guess, the third storyteller I know of that's been to Russia. First being Mike Adams, and then David Hutchins. Well,
Yeah.
those of I know of probably dialogue. That's great. I mean, it is said that Russians are in terms of training. If you go to an American, any European group, you are welcome, but you have some credit of trust, and if you fail to perform, you fail, and there's no going back. But with Russians, you have to earn it from the start, but then on
Oh
the
yeah.
second day you can go drink vodka, and it's
Yeah,
all
yeah.
right because
Let
you're
me tell
friends.
you, it was a tough crowd at the start, but they all warmed up, and we actually did. We went. I remember my first time we went on a river cruise on the river in Moscow and drank vodka together. Very
That's
nice.
what I'm talking about. It's
Exactly.
the
Yeah.
same. I hope we can do it again
I hope
after
so
this
too.
finishes this whole COVID story. All right, Bill, that's an amazing dialogue we're having, but we're getting to the end of it. Time is limited, so let me just ask you two of my favorite questions. I ask them to all of the storytellers I invite, and well, it's now your turn. So the first one goes like this: what would be your advice for people who want to develop their storytelling abilities, but they're only at the beginning of the story, of this journey?
My biggest advice is think about storytelling as a skill and as a craft. And like every skill, a skill can be taught, it can be sharpened, but you have to be willing to work at it. What I often say to people is, look, storytelling will work for you, but you have to be willing to put a little bit of work into your storytelling to make sure that story is going to work for you. So like any skill, it takes some practice and it takes some development time. Not a lot, but it does take some, but it's well worth it. Once people get over that initial hump and realize, oh, that was actually a pretty good story, I did a pretty good job of that. Once they recognize that, then they'll start doing it more and more, but you have to take that first step and be willing to put some work into it.
Great. Okay, I like how you not only put the practice into it, but taking it as a skill overall. That's a great
Yeah.
approach to it. Like we all know how to run, but in order to run a marathon, you have to train a bit. Well, maybe not a bit.
Yeah, no, but it's like I always say to people, look, I play the piano. So I grew up playing the piano. I can teach anyone how to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star on the piano. I can teach anyone the mechanics of it. Some people might have more natural talent at it than others, but anyone with enough practice can figure out how to play that song and play it confidently. And it's the same thing with storytelling, but you have to be willing to practice.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great perspective. Okay, the last question, and that's my favorite question of all. Can you finish a phrase that goes like this? It takes one thing to get from a good story to a great story, and that one thing is.
I would say that one thing is thinking strategically about it, making sure that you're not just telling any story, but you're telling the right story with the right message to the right audience, so that your audience looks at you and says, that was a really good point you just made. So that it's important to think strategically about
Great. I thought you would say that, and you've said
it.
it. That's great. That's a great conclusion. Bill, thank you so much for your time. That was
Hey,
amazing.
my pleasure.
Can you leave some contacts of yours so folks around here can contact you in case they have any projects or initiatives?
Yeah, so you can find me on social media at Storyteller Bill. So I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Storyteller Bill. But our website is BB&Co Storytelling, BBCO Storytelling.com. And so, or just Google Storyteller Bill Baker, and it will pop up somewhere.
Okay, perfect. Bill, thank you so much. And thank you for joining me today and sharing your knowledge. And please stay safe in those tough times. Let your stories be heard by more people and engaged by more people.
You too, Arnhem. It was a real pleasure. Hey, thought for you.